Okay, everyone, we're sorting out a few people who are having trouble getting in. We think there'll be a few more. So once Charles gets here, we'll officially start.
We'll begin, yeah.
In the meantime, feel free to put questions in the chat you might have about this topic. Say hi to old friends, make some new ones.
Actually, let me use this moment also to ask, is that generally what everyone wanted to get out of this conversation, or were there things you would rather have covered that I didn't sort of include in that overview? This is one of the Zoom issues. We can talk about the empty screen.
We're open to your expertise. You guys have planned a session. I'm sure it's going to be great.
Okay.
I was just going to say, I'm Sarah Whitestone. I teach English, and Charlie and I came in on the same year several years ago. And so we've talked a lot about his work with memory. And I'm really interested how memory or your perception can change because of what you see on social media and how that sticks. Whether you can be disabused of it later. It seems to me that we tend to, when we see over and over something that's not true, we might be more susceptible to thinking that it's true or remembering something that's not real. And so that's kind of my question is, how does that become pervasive? And how do we teach our students to look out for that? Even the subtle, it's in your memory, but it's not real.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys are aware of the recent study at Stanford of undergraduate students, again, arguably a very high academic performing group of people. The significant majority of them could not distinguish between fake news and as shown on social media and real news, which is kind of terrifying, you know. And that's not specifically about memory, but it's that study, you know, pointed more towards our cognitive biases to just see something and believe what, you know, according to the lens that we look at it, and that sort of becomes the overriding driving force for what we will remember from whatever we've read or seen out there. And then dealing with that pedagogically is a much greater challenge. With my students from a research methods and a policy standpoint, 2 classes, I usually start with the question of moral panics and, you know, how we even policy is made without any solid basis in fact, and asking students to think about where what they have seen as examples of moral panics in the past, and then to try to identify those on social media, and go through that process of critically analyzing what makes this look believable versus another thing, and then how do you back up what you're seeing with other facts. And I found that to be a useful exercise, even when you're beginning to present research methods or a quantitative course, to speak to the importance of why do we have this fact-finding process? Why is that important as a tool for all of us in society? Even if you want to become a police officer, you don't want to go on and get a doctoral degree or anything like that, but just sort of as an initial entry point and a basis. So.
Isn't this all part of a more global context of digital literacy, even being able to gauge the validity of a website? Because if you're doing fact checking, you still need the digital literacy to determine whether or not a website is valid.
Completely, and I think that's got to be built into. I gave the example of research courses, and policy courses, but I think it needs to be built into more across the curriculum with everything that we do. And the implications are more terrifying, as I think Sarah was getting at, because if we can't do that right, and we're not prepared to look closer for the truth, it actually becomes fact in our mind. That's what we remember. It is fact. And I think these echo chambers that we're going into largely through social media is what continues to foster that. And of course, Charlie's research speaks exactly to these dynamics. So
yeah, one of the things that I'm trying to get my students, I'm actually in a summer course right now teaching English 201, and one of the things that I'm trying to get them to talk about is what is a credible source. And I feel like it's getting harder and harder to teach them that. You know, I've been teaching English at the college level about 15 years, and I feel like social media is making it harder for them to even understand what a credible source is, and then how to look to make sure that it's a real source that you can follow or not. So that's another area where I'm not sure how to dig deeper, to, you know, show them even more. You know, it's one of those things I start to beat my head against lately.
Well, it is, I think, as Judy said, around the standards of digital literacy is how I approach it. But it's very hard to do that in the classroom because it requires students going to social media on their own and then reporting back to you. That's the way I've chosen to handle it. I don't know if anyone else has tried alternative strategies. It's not like in Blackboard we can necessarily actively engage in that exercise, other than to perhaps, you know, tour them through various examples of social media that we've. Lauren's got her hand. That we have prepared. Lauren Shapiro.
My mic off. Okay, I want to put my mic back on. So,
go ahead.
A couple of things. I'm sure most of you have heard of the CRAP test. The CRA. Sometimes they add another AP, where you're telling them, is this source current? Is it reliable? Is it given by an authority? And what is its purpose? And I've had students realize, kind of late in the game since it's college, oh, now I understand why this is so important. And the first time I've ever seen it in the school system is my son goes to a private school, and they included that for his 9th grade high school. But other than that, you don't usually see people making any comments. And then, to borrow a line from a TV show, there's a lady, she lives in here. I don't have to know anything. I just ask her a question and she tells me the answer. And they're comfortable with that. Like, you get information from the woman on, or man, or whoever you have programmed on here. She tells you stuff, and that's good enough for them. They don't have to put any more effort in.
That's right. That's right. And that's why for me, from the perspective of a research methods class or a policy analysis class, the digital literacy standards are an important place to go, because it's that question of authority that becomes very important. What is it that makes something true or not true? What is it that you're looking for? And if you can break that out into sort of a process by which you look at information, that then becomes something that the students can use throughout the course to engage with the material and hopefully take it outside of the classroom as well. So, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
But I also think that if they go on to Facebook, or if they go on to Instagram, or whatever social media platform they're using, if that platform is gathering all this data for them, it seems like this platform really understands me, and it's so in line with how I think, and how can I resist? It's like, if you have a question about how to fix your car, you don't ask the mechanic, you ask your best friend who knows nothing about it, because you trust your best friend. It's the psychology of it.
Exactly. And then part of that psychology also I found with my students is sort of the design of a site where they're getting their information from. So it looks like a news article, and that's enough to bring the stamp of authority to them. And so it's helping them to break that down and see, no, it's not just about the design of what's there. It's really about the information, and what is the source of the information. It's always about the source. Where is it coming from? Clickbait, Judy says. Yes, exactly. How would you determine clickbait, Judy?
Well, so, something looks legitimate. You know, it's got the shape, the markings of something that might be authoritative, but you know, but it's not. It's just it's drawing you into it, and you click on it, and it's going to a source that is fake news.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's but not having any other basis to filter through. That's what the Stanford
Right.
study really shows us is we'll just go with what looks the most and then also appeals the most to us. And when we're stuck in our own world of social media, we're only going to continually to reinforce that, and cognitively it becomes all we'll remember from what we see from other parts of the internet. Adam, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, not a problem. I joined a minute or two late, so if you brought this up in the beginning, I apologize. One of the things that I've noticed recently, and I think that's starting to be acknowledged, is that both news and social media are using complex algorithms to keep people engaged rather than show them the truth. And these engagement algorithms are engineered to confirm the pre-existing biases that already exist in people, rather than to help show them a balanced, both sides of the story type of thing. Yeah. And certain platforms are far worse than others, but it's these engagement algorithms that put profit over the truth that are, I think, are causing a very significant problem in our society.
Yeah, it's true. I've actually had a nightmare that speaks to the algorithms. I'm actually someone that's terrified of spiders. I don't know if anyone else is, but I guess I clicked on something with a tarantula or something in Facebook, and then all of a sudden, every time I'm on Facebook, all I get are these tarantula things in my news feed. It freaks me out, and you can't break it. I mean, I don't know how you break it because I'm now stuck in an algorithm that's only showing me that type of thing, and it's terrifying. But from go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say my son-in-law works in media and does that kind of algorithm, and he was saying what you need to do is click the opposite of what you like. A couple of times go to things that's completely the opposite of what you like, and that'll readjust your algorithm a little bit. So go to something else like sharks or I don't know. But every once in a while, if you click on something that is not appealing to you, it shakes the algorithm up a little bit. So you can try it.
Because I literally drop my phone sometimes when the speaks.
Yeah, right.
Oh, and here is our expert on social media coming on, so that's good. But yeah, I think, but it boils down to the CRAP acronym is one example of this sort of digital literacy approach that can be given to students to help them sort through these things. But there are others out there, and I think just like teaching critical thinking anywhere else, if you can get them to not just be able to recite it and these are the steps of it, but really see why this is important. And that's where as a professor I've found I have to be very focused and be able to provide them with examples of something that is I've been able to validate as inherently fake news versus something else, and use that as a way to get them hopefully the light bulbs to go on and realize this and then take it out into the world with them. I have found the challenge in this to be, and I'll turn it over to Charlie. I don't want to appear political as I engage in this exercise with students. So I in the examples of social media that I find that's misinformation, I try to give it from both sides of the spectrum, because the minute we as professors try, if we're not careful with that, they can shut down just on that alone. Has been my experience. Charlie, you're the one. Charlie, we've been speaking about you being the a research expert on social media, and so we've been waiting. I've been waiting with bated breath, but in the meantime, we have been engaging in a little discussion around misinformation and the Stanford study and social media. Maybe all of this is a good way to lead into some of the research that you have done in this topic that everyone's wanting to hear. Maybe I'll turn the floor back to you for a bit here.
Yeah, definitely. First, I just want to apologize. I don't know what's going on. I'm on campus, and it seems like the internet's not that great for some reason. So this isn't quite ideal, but I may try to still join through my computer, which might make it a little bit easier. But can everyone hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yep. Okay, great. Yeah, so as Heath said, those that don't know me, my name's Charlie Stone. I'm an associate professor here at John Jay in psychology, and my research focuses on how social influences shape the way people remember the past. And that's quite general because a lot of my research is varied. So it kind of goes from conversations to media to internet, social media, and how that kind of shapes how people remember, as Heath was just talking about, misinformation, but also their personal paths, how it forges collective memories, and maybe some ways to kind of mitigate that. So I mean, I was envisioning being here a lot earlier and kind of starting things off and setting the stage. So maybe some of the things I'm about to say, Heath has already kind of covered. But we're trying to take the term conversation literally. So this isn't a presentation. So I think both Heath and I are happy to take questions as they come. And so there is no formal presentation. There's no PowerPoint. And to the extent that there's some structure, I was thinking we could first talk a little bit about misinformation, as Heath was doing, and then talk maybe about some general aspects about just the internet and technology and memory, and then transition into kind of the topics that were actually outlined in the actual conversation. So we'll talk a bit about social media, and then also the learning outcomes associated with teaching through Zoom, and so forth. And part of the reason why I want to talk about misinformation is, again, it wasn't really detailed into the outline of what we would talk about today, but it seems like the elephant in the room, right? It's the hot topic people are interested in. And I think for a lot of people that believe that they're very kind of logical, they can't seem to understand why this misinformation seems to be believed and then also disseminated and so forth. And I think one of the helpful ways to kind of start with this is, I mean, in psychology, we talk about two different pathways of persuasion, the direct way and the indirect way. And so the direct way to persuade someone to believe something would be give them facts, right? Your chances of getting injured in a plane is very low versus a car and so forth. The indirect way is more emotional, right? Kind of hitting them where their kind of emotion, their beliefs already kind of stem and so forth. So the example I like to give is like cologne and perfume, right? It's very indirect, right? I've never seen a cologne or perfume company ever say, 9 out of 10 men love the smell of this perfume or anything like that, right? It's just sexy people on rooftops at night. Usually a pool is involved, right? There's no real factual information that you're going to glean from those that are going to say like, oh, that is a good perfume, or oh, that is a good cologne. It's really just trying to tug at your emotional heartstrings to want to be like them, right? And so when we look at the misinformation that seems to be spread across social media, that's a lot of what's going on, right? So a lot of the information people tend to believe is the information that is kind of emotionally evocative, right? That scares people and so forth. And so when people are presented with this information, they react to it more readily, right? And it becomes even harder to then dissuade people of that information with facts, right? This is why it's hard to get someone on a plane if they're fearful of a plane, right? You could give them all the facts about the likelihood of you crashing in a plane. Doesn't matter, right? They're still going to be fearful. And so that's one of the things that makes a lot of the misinformation that's spreading on the internet difficult. The other part that makes it very difficult is any of you that are on Facebook, for example, right? We fall into our silos. And so we tend to be friends with people of similar attitudes, right? And so what we find too is what happens is when you're surrounded with people with similar attitudes, we get what's called group polarization, right? Yeah. So if you're a liberal and you're hanging out or chatting with other liberals, what we find is you become more liberal after chatting with them, right? Or if you're conservative and you're chatting with other conservatives, you become more conservative. And the other component to that is those people are going to be more likely to post information that already aligns with your attitudes and beliefs, right? And we know that when we get presented with things that already align with our attitudes and beliefs, we're more likely to kind of take it on, right? Whether it's true or whether it's false as well. And so those are some of the factors that make it really particularly difficult. And that's just the spread of misinformation. Adding it to social media makes it even more pernicious, just because we also know through research that posts that have more likes are more believed, right? And so if someone starts spreading some fake information and it gets a lot of likes, people tend to ascribe likes with authenticity, right? If a lot of people like this, this must actually be true. Otherwise, why would they like it? Right. But, you know, people could like it or comment on it for a lot of different reasons, right? Like I'll watch Fox News sometimes, not because I like Fox News, but just because I want to see what's going on out there. So we can't necessarily ascribe likes with any kind of veracity. But when people see posts that have been liked a lot, you know, people are more likely to believe it. And one thing about that, too, is we know social media is like an addiction. It's like gambling to a certain extent. So they've done studies where part of the brain that's associated with the reward center, when people get likes, when people get comments, when people get retweets and so forth, it actually activates the part of the brain that is activated when people are gambling. It's a pleasure center. So we have this kind of innate kind of desire now to kind of get likes, get tweets. And one of the problems with that is what the things that get the most likes tend to be outrageous. Right. And so when people are presented with fake information, maybe they know it's fake, but they might think it's funny or something like that. So they'll send it out into the ether and then they'll get more likes. Right. So it becomes this kind of vicious cycle and so forth. And then as it gets more likes, it becomes more believable. And then at the same time, it's then hard to use the direct pathway of persuasion, right? Facts, to dissuade people from that because they have this emotional reaction that aligns with their already established kind of political beliefs that makes it much more entrenched. I mean, I'm not a fan of Trump, but arguably the best thing he did from a political standpoint for whatever he was trying to achieve was, you know, the fake news kind of thing, right? It added some layer of doubt, right? And it allowed people to kind of fall into their silos and be like, well, your news is fake, my news is real, and vice versa and so forth. And so once that happens, it really becomes difficult to really, you know, kind of know what is truth. Because, you know, I always say to my class, right, the most dangerous person is the person that believes that they're unbiased, right? Everything's biased to a certain extent. I'm biased in, you know, being a cognitive psychologist. But, you know, and so that means that any kind of news source is going to be slightly biased in some capacity. And so I think what has made the present world and misinformation so dangerous is people are kind of doubling down on that. But obviously, a major difference is whether people and news organizations are willing to acknowledge mistakes. And there is research. Oh, yeah.
Just for the question, Charlie, I want to make sure I wasn't giving misinformation before you got on. This emotional content you're talking about, yes, is absolutely the key in terms of what is getting people to a certain place and why they think it's real, and that affects what they remember and how they interact with that. But the approach that I was raising, and then Lauren, we'll go to you. I see you have your hand up. What I have done with my students, and I was sharing this, is give them some sort of basic core standards of digital literacy, how to look for the source and whether something's valid as a way to break through that. And then what I'm wondering is, from your specific research in this area, is that a useful strategy to do that, given this emotional bias or confirmation bias that people are just susceptible to generally?
Yeah.
Or more persuasion than that?
No, I mean, I think that's the right path. So I know in Norway, they've started to implement kind of at an institutional level, kind of internet literacy, kind of what you were just talking about. And I think that it's a useful way. The only problem with that is, you know, humans are cognitive misers, right? We're quick. We kind of jump from tweet to tweet, to post. Yeah. And so it really relies upon an individual to do the due diligence. And I'm actually running a study right now looking at Whether these flags of disputed fake news, when presented with that, will that lead people to be more likely to click on a link to learn the truth, or not? And so it's kind of the $1 million question, and it's one of those things too in which we're really relying upon your students to be like, I learned this, and now I'm going to do a little bit more dirty work, right? It's going to take.
Whether it's effective. But by the way, Lauren Shapiro has her hand up for you.
Yep.
So I'll jump up.
Charlie.
Hey, good to see you again.
So I'm thinking through this, and I know that on this article I was writing about countering the radicalization for terrorism, if you have someone who has a belief, they gain those beliefs slowly over time. And even if they're in that echo chamber because they're in one silo versus another, the one thing that you can never do to convince someone is to basically just present fact after fact after fact and say, you see, this is the reason you're wrong, right? But
yeah, exactly.
Do until they get into this shouting match. It's like, no, you're wrong. It was a resurrection. No, it was just a friendly little visit, little tour around the Capitol by nice people. And so, like, they go and they shout at each other, and they don't realize that neither one can ever hear the other. And maybe it's part of cognitive dissonance, and you're so entrenched in your ideas because, God forbid you're wrong. How ridiculous are you going to look? So, I mean, if you can address it from that perspective, is what would be the best method to present an opposing view without, in a slow process, which of course people hate doing, so that they actually will learn it?
Right, and that's the $1 million question as well. So we just submitted a grant in collaboration with Shweta here at John Jay and computer science and people at Columbia, and we're working on some kind of program, some kind of means in which we can maybe infiltrate and try to persuade. I mean, one thing we know is, in-group, out-group matters, right? And so if you were talking with an in-group member, they would do a better job of trying to persuade somebody of a different belief. If it's an out group, you're going to get exactly what you were just talking about, Lauren, right? It's going to be like, well, you're somebody different, right? Of course, you don't agree with me on this because we don't agree on a lot of things. We're not sharing any kind of in-group membership. So I think one of the ways in which might be more effective in trying to persuade people of that is to get people, within their group, right? And so this is why it's critically important to have, say, conservatives or even Trump to come out and say, get the vaccine. It's safe, right? Because then you have somebody on the inside. But then, I mean, psychologically speaking, we also then see people make subcategories, right? Then if someone kind of says something you disagree with, then you kind of say, oh, they're a Trumper and I'm a conservative now. And so now that's the distinction that we make. So it becomes difficult to kind of persuade people of something that's so entrenched is wrong.
And this is why, Charlie, I was saying, I have always felt the pressure to present, if I'm giving examples, I'm giving it across the political spectrum. Does that even break through at all, or?
It's a better way, right? Because the biggest task is kind of to present yourself as unbiased as best as possible, or to be very upfront that I am biased and this is how and what way. But I think we can all agree that we want to have shared facts that this is how the world actually is. And it can be particularly difficult to do that. And like Lauren was saying, I mean, when you throw facts at people's faces, there's enough misinformation out there generally as well to be able to say like, well, I have this fact, I have that fact too. And so that becomes a battle, right? And people then take it personally, right? So, we're talking about the insurrection on January 6th, right? Why should I hold that personally? But, if someone comes up to me and starts saying, oh, it was just a couple of friendly people hanging around, I'm going to be like, no, what are you talking about, right? And then it becomes a personal kind of affront. And so, I mean, we don't really have the answers, right? And so, because if we did, we would have ways to kind of mitigate it and help stop the spread. But I mean, I think the secret sauce is a combination of ensuring that you group members helping push the narrative that is actually factual, and also then doing it in a calm way rather than getting in a heated battle. Because like Lauren was saying, when we do see when people start doing that, it just pushes people further into, it has kind of an ironic effect that when you're trying to help people learn more facts, they just like, well, you know what, I'm going to be right. And by right, that means I'm going to be even more extreme in my belief and in my views and so forth. So it's a delicate, fine line. I mean, I think a good way about it is, I mean, there is some misinformation that gets spread on the liberal side, and I'm not trying to pretend that everyone
absolutely
in here is liberal. I'm assuming a lot are, but you know, it's about acknowledging those as well. And I, even myself, I find it kind of difficult sometimes to accept or do the deep dive because I want to believe that they're true. So why do I want to find out that they're false? And so I think
we have a question. We have a question from Sarah related to this. How much does misinformation stick in our memories, even if we know it is wrong? How much does that then affect our emotional bias?
Okay, Sarah, thanks for the question. It feels like a podcast now.
Hi, Charlie. So good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Quick side note, where are you right now?
I am in Virginia.
Very nice.
Yeah, it has been nice. Good to see you in your office, though. That gives us hope that we're going to be in our offices soon.
We're going to get back there.
Yeah, maybe one day. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only one.
Yeah.
It's a great question. And the problem is we don't really know, right? I mean, this is what actually got me interested in memory in the first place is at some level, without any kind of vertical truth, you know, pictures, but even those can be misleading, videos and so forth. We don't really know what is true. Right? Like, I mean, I talk with my college friends about all the things we did back in college over and over again. Do I know they actually happened? I have no idea. Do I care? Not really at some level.
This be more driven by our confirmation bias generally. So if the misinformation fits into, as you were saying before, our own way of thinking, that's what then we'll stick with in terms of the memory side of it.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think Sarah's almost getting to the point, like if there's a warning, right? If you're kind of aware that misinformation is coming in and you know it's misinformation,
I see.
What happens there? And so, and the problem, warnings do help to a certain extent. But part of the problem too is it's what's known as source monitoring. And what we know is humans are actually quite good at kind of remembering content, but we're much worse at remembering the source. Right. Yeah. And so when we're presented with misinformation and we're even aware that it's misinformation, now we're relying upon this kind of higher order functioning of our brain to be able to monitor and be like, that's the misinformation. Right. But maybe a month down the line, if you lose the source of where you got that information, now you're just left to your own devices to decide, you know, was that from someone that provides me with truthful information, or was that the time I got misinformation and so forth? And repetition makes it harder, right? So this is one of the ironies and difficulties that the news has, right? Because what you'll see the news do is they try to fact check everything, right? They'll say, Trump said X, we want to make it clear this is fake, right? Or false news. Now, the problem is they keep rehearsing it, right? And so at some level, that's getting in, right? And so later down, that's going to be more accessible. And now you're relying upon the human to be like, wait, is that information that was then followed by that this was fake or misinformation, or was that not, right? And so the more people repeat misinformation, even trying to say it's wrong, they may unwillingly be spreading more misinformation, ironically, just because it's making it more sticky. It's making it, I mean, one of the basic tenets of memory is retrieval rehearsal leads to better recall, right? And we're less better at, you know, remembering the warnings, for example. But that's the tough bind media is in, right? Because you don't want to just let misinformation slide and be like, we're not repeating that. And so there needs to be a happy medium where they can still point out that what person X said and what it was is fake and not true without necessarily rehearsing it over and over again. So, you know, you could be exposed to a lot of information and been told that that was misinformation. But a month later, 2 months later, it's possible that you would forget which information was warned about and which information wasn't, and be walking around with a lot of misinformation, unfortunately.
So my follow-up question to that, Charlie, would be, is this tactic really kind of like a mind-washing tactic that would be used in mind control and things? Because it feels like it's just so drip, 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 drip that you almost can't climb out of the misinformation sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd use like brainwashing necessarily, but it's I mean, this is why the Russian government is paying a lot of money to infiltrate Facebook pages, right? Because it works.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
And so, I mean, so one of the things that we're working on with other people in computer science is trying to come up with a program that can identify the time and place of when videos and pictures were taken and whether they've been manipulated in any way. Because in a lot of the misinformation, so they make a distinction between misinformation and disinformation, right? So misinformation is just wrong information, but there's no intention, right? Like I may mistakenly say something, but it's wrong, but I'm not intentionally trying to disseminate any information. Disinformation is the intentional act to mislead people with information. And so what you'll see with a lot of the Russian hackers and so forth, right? They'll just kind of splice and compose random acts of violence or whatever and just say, this is the Black Lives Matter protest or something like that. When in reality, right, it could be taken from Eastern Europe videos or, wherever. So the veracity of that information is really in doubt. But yeah, it does. I mean, this is when people talk about there's two Americas. I don't necessarily ascribe to that, but I mean, we do get locked into our echo chambers. And then the information that we're presented with, tends to align with what we already believe or want to believe. And it makes it that much harder for people to dissuade them. And especially since the people that want to dissuade you are from an outgroup, right? It's usually the liberals want to persuade the conservatives and vice versa. And so it becomes particularly difficult to walk that line. And then again, going back to the point that I made about Trump is basically saying all liberal news or news is fake, that now we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater to a certain extent. And it becomes that much harder to kind of grasp what we kind of think is accurate information about the world around us.
And that's been 100% his tactic, an active tactic, just to keep repeat. And like you said, there's not any good way to break from that. Sort of wrapping sort of this discussion of misinformation up, what would you say are sort of your go-to approaches in the classroom pedagogically to handle this? I've talked about sort of the digital literacy standards, like going that approach and working through trying to give students a framework that they could take out into the world. Is there anything else that you would recommend as a way to break in on these issues?
No, I think what you said is, at the moment, the best that we can do is really try to encourage students to do their due diligence. That just because your friends sent you something that seems exciting or something like that does not necessarily mean that it's true, and that they should search for news sources that they trust. Yeah, I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I mean, I think the guiding principle at the moment in terms of trying to counteract this is at the root level, right? I mean, so at some level as adults, I mean, it might be too late, right? Teaching an old dog new tricks. But if we can get the newer generations kind of this literacy, this kind of understanding that what is presented via social media or the internet is not necessarily accurate, and that you need to do your due diligence, is arguably our best path forward. But it becomes particularly difficult. I mean, I think someone asked a question about the emotionality of it.
And Judy's asking that again. She's saying, if so much of this disinformation is tied to emotion, how can we help students separate it to better analyze it? And I think that's what you're speaking to. Sorry.
Right. And it becomes very difficult because, and this is like what Lauren was saying earlier, so if it is an emotionally kind of held misinformation, it can easily become a battle, right? That people then, when you are trying to dissuade someone of something that they believe emotionally, it almost comes across as a personal attack, right? And so it's very difficult. I mean, from an empirical side, and I'm not necessarily saying I would say do this in the classroom, but you would almost want to appeal with them in an emotional way as well. But on this right side of the facts. Because again, you're really not going to, it's like fighting fire with a knife, right? Emotion versus facts, it's just not going to help.
Not gonna work.
So you want to fight fire with fire. And so if you can kind of appeal to them on an emotional level on the side of facts, you're going to be a lot more effective, right? And I think, and this is obviously a fact about COVID, but I think it also helped on the emotional level about, if you don't protect yourself, you might be putting your family members in danger, right? That's a nice fact, but it also tugs on the emotional strings of people, one would hope. Obviously, it didn't work for everybody, but I think it probably helped for some people that were on the fence, thinking that, well, no, I believe it might be, I don't need to wear a mask, but I don't want to risk killing my grandmother or my father or stuff like that. So if you can kind of tap into it a slightly emotional way with the fact, that would be probably your best effective way from an emotional level. But I think more cognitively, exactly what you said, Heath, it's about literacy and understanding the internet. But then the thing that sucks the most about the internet is it's at a very animalistic level. This the likes, the dopamine hits, the gambling association, right? And so part of what we want to do with the program is replace that with some kind of similar process, but where you get points or whatever for being factual or something like that, right? To kind of emulate this kind of internet drug of likes and comments and retweets and so forth, because that's a different level, right? That's a very base response that people have in terms of retweeting misinformation, because it's going to get a lot of likes, right? Because you might have a lot of people that know it's fake information, but they'll throw it out into the ether because they know people will respond. And that's a whole different problem to have to kind of address.
We've got 2 hands up, but just a note to everyone that Lauren has summarized the CRAP test, which again, is one of these sort of ways of talking about sources and critically analyzing material. She's put that in the chat, but we have a hands up from David is one. I think there might be another hand up. Let me just, David Shapiro. David.
Thank you.
Yes, there he is.
This is all very interesting, Charles and Heath. I have to tell you that when you started speaking about facts, one of the things that came to mind was, in my field, we sometimes refer to accounting facts. Now, I've always taken offense to that phrase, and I usually give the example of Enron, where the facts, the so-called accounting facts, are not the facts. I'm wondering, though, to my larger point here is, we speak about facts as if they're so accessible to all of us, but I'm wondering if really the real problem might be evidence, because we can't get at evidence often.
Right.
Evidence is often under the control of others, and there's no equal opportunity to evidence. So just using the Enron example, that was uncovered through some highly analytical efforts of some sophisticated financial analysts that took apart the so-called accounting facts on how they weren't really facts. And that had to be done because they really couldn't get at the evidence. The evidence was, in the care and custody of the Enron Corporation. So I'm wondering if, and what I wanted to ask from you guys is, what is your opinion of the power imbalance that exists vis-a-vis evidence, and on how and why that might make so-called reliance on facts not an effective method? Because if it were as simple as pointing to the arithmetic facts of 2 + 2 = 4, we could pat ourselves on the back and go home. But I think, isn't the problem because the facts may not really seem like the facts? Thank you.
I'll just quickly go, Charlie, then you can jump in.
Yep.
This is why, David, for me, as someone that teaches research methods and quantitative courses around evidence and policy, that I use this kind of a discussion of misinformation and digital literacy as a gateway into the process that underlies fact generation or evidence generation, but also providing some sensitivity to what do we mean by facts, because what you say is true. Because even if I have a well-designed scientific research study, it can still be subject to bias and misinformation as well. So I get there that way, but I certainly think the idea of a power imbalance with respect to the facts certainly is a reality. That's my way of getting there, but it doesn't necessarily address what you're saying. Charlie, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, David, I mean, that's an excellent question. And it really kind of speaks to the whole larger spectrum. And forgive me if this seems a little tangential, but like you said, the evidence is a power struggle, right? Who has access to that? And I think it connects to kind of what I was saying before. To get the evidence, right, takes effort. And humans are lazy, right? I mean, this is why we have investigative journalists and so forth to try to find that evidence and so forth. But it also kind of speaks to the larger picture of a lot of the research I do in terms of collective memory, right? I mean, what's the evidence of, anything in our historical past, and who has the power to kind of determine what is fact and what is not fact, right? I mean, we build monuments for a lot of old white people. We seem to silence a lot of the evidence and facts of people of color. And that shapes kind of who we are as Americans, as a country, and so forth. So at like a broader level, I think you're right. The evidence, we want evidence, but the evidence is hard to get. And it can often be occluded by the powers that be. With people intentionally or unintentionally trying to block access to the evidence. But even if it's unobstructed, it's hard to get the evidence, right? And we see that in a lot of the retellings of history, in which we're trying to get perspectives that aren't just kind of your traditional white guy perspective. But where do you get that evidence, right? And that takes a lot of effort to kind of dig into what's been passed, because we've been inundated for years about how great the US is and how we're perfect and all these things, which is patently not clear. But what's the evidence? And so it takes effort to kind of dig deep into that kind of stuff to help kind of change people's minds about misinformation at a smaller level, like we've been kind of talking about, but even in a grander level in terms of the literally kind of false collective memories that we have about past individuals that have permeated throughout our textbooks, our stories, and our media. And so I think that's a great question. And the power dynamics are critically important in terms of how misinformation is understood and who has the power to kind of back up their facts with evidence.
We have a hand up from Judy and then Andrea right after her.
Hi, thank you, Heath. So, it's interesting because I'm also thinking about from the student perspective and how this misinformation can also be perpetuated by people that we know, people that, the students know, and they're online. And there are all of these elements to being online. As I said, the anonymity, plus this, disinhibition effect that allows them to be somebody who they might not normally be. And that's very influential too. So, how can we kind of bring this to bring this to the fore and help students, put it on their radar that, hey, how they behave and what they're posting also, feeds into this either misinformation or influences other people who they know.
Right, and that's an excellent question. And I mean, and this is really where it gets more complex in the sense that, I mean, at some level, when we've been talking about this, we've almost been kind of assuming that people are on the internet to get information. And that's not necessarily why people are always on the internet, right? So especially our students, they're online maybe just to socialize, to have fun, just to muck it up or whatever, right? Not being like, oh, I need to learn facts. I need to get information. I need to know about the world, right? So they may have different goals when they're on social media. And so that kind of goes back to my point in which, so they might share information and they may even know it's misinformation, but their goal at that moment is to be trendy with their friends, right? Or to get more followers or something like that. And so they may unwittingly, because they weren't focused on the facts, they were more interested in being liked and so forth, they may disseminate this misinformation. And so I think one way to maybe try to combat that and talk with our students about that is that they need to be mindful of that. I mean, I think part of the problem is a lot of people just see the internet as fun, right? No one wants to do more work. Like, let's just have fun on the internet. But at some level, individuals, students are going to have to, it's going to be less fun. And people have to be, you know, conscious consumers, that what they do on the internet isn't just about them. Similar to COVID, right? What we do is not just about us, it's about the people around us and our family and so forth. And so I think it's important to kind of convey that to students, that while you may just be out there trying to get likes and have fun and do whatever, you may unwittingly be making, you know, people getting vaccinations more difficult. You may be unwittingly, you know, making people more, you know, the world a more dangerous place because of all the things. So I think it's important to kind of try to convey that point to students, that unfortunately it's not just all fun and games on the internet, and that they need to be mindful that what they send out there could influence their parents, could influence their friends, and could influence other people more generally.
Okay, we have Andrea. Sorry.
So here's my question. This is going back to Charlie, to your earlier statement about, you know, how we know history, because the idea of finding sources, expanding sources, and the credibility of sources has been the central question for history, for most history, for the last 40 years. It's the thing that we teach as an essential skill and continue to reinforce through every history class, is where you get evidence and how you expand the pool of evidence that we have, which is, that's a central. I have students work on a public archives project at the National Archives where they just tag things so that they understand this is how we enlarge the amount of information that, you know, the sources that we have. But I don't know how to tie that, because I know that really well and I know how to deal with that. And a lot of us do, because that's how, you know, we're trained to tie that into the internet without to information literacy, without there being a disconnect somehow, that making that translation from you have to check your sources when you write a paper to you have to check your sources when you're paying attention to something on the internet is a complicated question. And I understand that it's that students think about it differently when they're on Facebook than when they're when they're theoretically doing research, because mostly we know what happens when they do research is, when we ask them to do research is, they get the first hit on Google, and that's the same source that everybody else uses, right? And the quotes, sometimes it is sort of astonishing. So it's a huge conceptual leap of how we tie all of those things together, how, what's going on in the classroom has to do with, because they can do it when they're looking for a pair of shoes. If you ask students to go online and shop for a pair of shoes, they can do the research and they can organize their research findings, and they'll come up with the best pair of, cheapest price on a pair of shoes. They can't translate it. That's a really good question.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's a unit of analysis issue, right? I mean, so at some level, if we're asking students to be more mindful about the dissemination of information or the acceptance of information, we're asking them to essentially think of the group, right? That you might be making the world a worse place. But they look at it as, this is just me, I'm just doing this about me, right? And so that's why I think for them, shoes is easy research, right? Because the shoes are for me. I'm only impacting me. Whereas if we extrapolate it to the internet, now we're asking like, look, I get it. You know that's misinformation, or maybe not, but you have to do more due diligence. You have to make sure you don't just spread anything, not because of you necessarily, but because of what that might impact on everyone. And I mean, the COVID response and the vaccination rollout is a great example of that, right? We're asking people to go from, it's not just about you, it's about we. And even that was difficult, and it still is. And that we're talking about life or death, not even necessarily just the dissemination of misinformation. And so I think it really speaks to why we're having this conversation, right? Why it's so difficult. It's because it is really difficult. And the answers are not going to be simple, and they're going to be complex, that's for sure.
We have Gohar wanting to jump in here too.
I just have a very general comment and thought here. When we talk about evidence, we I think also need to be aware of the fact that there may be evidence on pretty much anything they want to find. On one issue, there is even empirical evidence, right? They can possibly find on two sides, like one that's really not so correct or something that really reaffirms their conventions and beliefs, and one on the totally opposite side. So if they already go in with having an idea of what they want to look for, they will only go to the sources that provide them the evidence, even the empirical evidence, right? That also that already confirms their own sets of beliefs that they know. So they kind of refuse. So how do we really instruct the students, right, to be able to maybe, and a lot comes also from their, I think, lack of skill of understanding the methods, right, that were used in this particular research, the validity of the findings, you know, maybe the ranking of the journal that it was published in, whether it's really that reliable, or it was something with type of an article that was rejected so many times that was eventually published in some kind of low-ranking journal that needed publications nevertheless, right? So how do we also kind of help them go through all of that, even empirical, right, evidentiary research?
So I feel you and I probably approach this the same way. I go right into the process and the empirical research and how you determine what's good or not good. But I'm learning, I think, through this conversation and by a lot of the things that Charlie has said, that's probably not the best approach. Maybe to teach methods, yes, it's okay, but to break through this issue that we're talking about with misinformation, Charlie says it's connecting to the emotional piece of it, and I feel I'm sorely lacking in that through this conversation. It's a little bit what David was getting at too, but Charlie, I'll let you jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great point, Gohar. And it's something Heath had kind of alluded to, and it's what we call confirmation bias in psychology, that people tend to only search for information that already supports their prior beliefs. And so that can be particularly pernicious. I mean, one thing you could probably do is, you know, on one day of class, just have students come up with a hypothesis of something and have them find some research. And then now ask them, okay, now I want you to do everything you can to try to find research to disprove that hypothesis, right? And then they're going to have to dive into two competing areas, and then they're going to have to grapple with. And then going back to Heath's point, you could then connect that to, okay, now let's look at these designs. Who did they recruit? How many people? Where did they recruit them from? What was the design of the study? And maybe once you start doing that deeper dive with these two bodies of literature that kind of seem opposing, you know, something might come out of it. And that hopefully what will come out of it is maybe one line of that research was quite faulty, or maybe only used certain demographics of students, or there was a fault in their design and so forth. But that might be a nice way to really kind of make kids or students' heads explode, right? You're really kind of asking them to keep two thoughts in at once, and they're going to have to try to reconcile why is that the case. Because I think you're absolutely right, and this is again why we get into these debates with people, because people can cite sources to kind of opposing things that then makes what is the truth, what is fact, what is the evidence out there, is that there are competing lines of some potential evidence that then people then go down one path just because they eat it up, since it aligns with what they already believe.
Yeah, I kind of do something similar to what you recommended. I always, let's say, for discussing a very heated topic, I first of all collect information about which side of the topic they're on, literally, and then I have them argue. If it's a debate that they need to do in class, I have them actually argue the opposite side of what they believe in. So they really have to be very well aware of what the argument is on the other side, or what the evidence is about the arguments of the other side, and be able to argue something that I guess impacts their confirmation bias, right? That what they believe may not necessarily be to the argument that they should be arguing, and they should be really always, holistic approach to the problem, right? You need to know both sides, and for you to make your argument stronger, you really need to know what you're really arguing against. So I think that helped a little bit for them in their analytical thinking. But it also it's a lot more of I think it's a little bit of a difficult level of thinking for them, and it requires a lot more effort, a lot more, processing of information, and a lot more in-depth understanding of that information before they can actually articulate it a little bit better.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great idea. And you were speaking and you obviously said debate, but it took me back to my debate class in high school. And, like you said, the first level of debate is understand your enemy and kind of undercut them. Like, my opponent's going to say X, Y, Z, exactly. And this is why they're wrong. And so, but you still have to know both sides. So I think that's a really clever and good way to do it. Are we going till 3 or 3:30? I don't recall.
3, I think.
We're going until 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, perhaps this is a good time to sort of open the floor to positive things people have done with social media. So we've talked about the negative side, but there have been, I've seen some very effective strategies that other people are using for social media in the classroom. It doesn't focus on this sort of negative misinformation side of things. I'm wondering if anyone has had anything that's worked for them successfully.
I was going to say I've done a few things with trying to help students understand. I teach rhetoric, so trying to help them understand how they can steer a conversation, take control of the conversation. So we talk a lot about what do you want to put out there, and how do you want to kind of take charge of this debate on Facebook or on Twitter. And that, I think, has been helpful, because sometimes they feel like they don't have a voice, but when you empower them with a voice and say, now, how are you going to respond to this? And I think just having that empowerment helps them a little bit to feel like they do have a way to go into a conversation and make a difference.
Yeah, that's great. And they're actively doing this on social media, or sort of mock doing it in your classroom?
No, they're doing it on social media. A lot of what we try to do, I've done in the past, is have them write a short story or something and put it up, and then they have, they get feedback from that from other people that they're having readers and things like that. But also, just how do you make a comment? A comment on social media is different than writing an academic paper, obviously. And so the rhetorical control of writing a comment on Facebook, how do you actually do that, and what can make a difference? And in Charlie's talk about appealing to emotions, I do ask them to think about appealing to emotion a little bit in ways that you might not in academic writing so much.
That's good. I've seen professors also in a less controlled way, they require, for example, their students to follow them on Twitter. Eric Pisa does this, and I think it's really excellent. He uses that as a way to corral. He reaches out to them through social media, says, look at this article, that article, and as well as gives them information about what's coming up in the class or whatever. And I think it's a useful strategy, particularly when you're dealing with students like we are now in a more online environment where we're not as connected to them. I wanted to throw that out there as something that I've seen someone do that I think is very effective. Anyone else have any thoughts or strategies they've done with social media? Okay, if we can, maybe Charlie and I can take us just out of the strictly social media world, unless you guys have other thoughts or questions about it, and move more to this reality we all suddenly had to face of Zoom and synchronous classes, and what that's meant in terms of pedagogically how you've tackled it, and then the learning outcomes that have come with it. For me, I'll say I've even done workshops on online delivery through the lessons I've learned in an asynchronous environment. But this synchronous world was totally something new to me. And I don't know if any of you struggled as well in the beginning, because there's lots of inherent pitfalls there. And I think a lot of it, when I talk about pedagogy for asynchronous environments, it's about how do you keep that student-centered focus. And then you go to a synchronous environment, it's the same question, but I think from what I've seen in talking to other colleagues is we a lot of us have lost that. It's become almost this authoritarian environment of the professor there talking to a screen, and so much gets lost in there. I mean, and how do you maintain that level of student engagement and certainly improve learning outcomes through that? And we thought maybe we could start a discussion around that. Not that I won't portray myself as an expert in the area. It's certainly something I've struggled to improve as we've gone through this process, but I think it might be useful for us to sort of pivot to that type of a discussion too, if you're all in agreement. I see a hand from Scratch That, Gina. Scratch That idea, Gina, you don't like it?
No. I responded to the wrong direct message. Go ahead.
Okay. I see Judy also has her hand up, so we'll go there.
So, okay, so I just wanted to address the issue of Zoom. I mean, when there was a quick pivot, it was obvious that people wanted to take what we're doing in the classroom and translate it online digitally through Zoom. And I have to apologize because I'm having internet problems today. Usually I would be on video, but it would just be, I'm just having some challenges. They're working on it outside, so my apologies. But I did want to say that, yes, there are a lot of challenges in using Zoom and using, synchronous, web conferencing, but there are tools. And it was a matter of coming up to speed with some of these tools on how you can use them creatively, like the breakout rooms, like even the chat function, like the polling. And so that adds to the engagement. And part of this, as and we all know, with teaching, some of it is just being creative and thinking creatively. How can we use these tools? In the middle of your presentation, you can throw out a question and just say, okay, everybody answer in chat in 1 second, and everybody's answering and everybody's engaged by actually, typing in their answers. If you have breakout sessions, you can prepare them in advance. You can have, specific, worksheet, like one person in the group has to, fill in the worksheet, but everybody is talking and they're very engaged with each other. And then you come back and debrief. So I think it's a matter of learning the tools that are available and not trying to replicate what we're doing in the classroom, but rather consider the educational objectives that you want to reach and use the tools of the modality that you're teaching in to reach it.
I completely agree. And for me, it was learning those tools. I was a bit of a horror story at first because I don't know. I hate to say that you're recording me, but let's be honest. I was a little bit of a horror story because my way, if any of you have seen me teach, my way of teaching is very Socratic. It's all that interactive discussion, and I thought, wow, that with the synchronous world, I can put the slides up, and it can be like I'm in the classroom, and I very quickly learned that's not the case. First of all, I would throw the questions out, and then if you're not careful about it, it can just become this sort of everyone talking over each other, and that's a horror story by itself. So it's like, how do you keep that student engagement that we know that's what's going to make them remember things and engage with the material? That became quickly a disaster that I had to learn about. And I also found I would gauge how successful things were coming across through the students that have their cameras on. Because it's that thing in the classroom, we can't quantify that, those nonverbal cues we get from our students that tells us what's going on. But the problem, so I was thinking, wow, that class went really well. And in this one class I'm speaking of now, it's 100 students. So you can imagine that on Zoom. But I also have TAs in that class, which ultimately will save the story down the line. But the TAs I was thinking, wow, they really seem to be getting it. What great discussions we're having. And the TAs were like, oh. I mean, they're not grasping what everything that's going on there. And it was counter to what I was seeing, because whereas in the face-to-face environment, I would have picked that up right away, because even if there are those 5 students that are very interactive, you can see, again, the nonverbal cues of everyone around.
Can I follow up?
Yeah, go ahead, of course, Judy.
Because, it's something that's really challenging. And I think, Charlie might be able to speak to this also. It's very, there's a challenge in online learning in general, is how can you assess the disposition of a student who's online? I mean, that's really a challenge. But what Gina posted is so accurate, because I think the issue of pivoting to teaching online, whether it be synchronously or asynchronously, is not the technology. It's the fact that it's a paradigm shift in thinking about how you're teaching. And so you're teaching in the classroom one way, but you have to understand that the online environment is a different environment, and you have to develop it for that environment to meet the same objectives. And and there may be tools that can meet those objectives, differently, without you depending on assessing the disposition in a classroom.
And that's where I had to get. But for me, my bottom line in helping me get there was, again, what do we know works as an effective teacher? And that's a student-centered delivery pedagogy. I'm sure that's what most of us in this room believe and do. But the question for me became, how do I maintain that through a synchronous Zoom setting? And so it became learning about those tools, which hopefully through this discussion we'll get to. But I completely agree with what you're saying, Judy. I think we got 2 hands up here. We got Gohar and then Lauren.
I think Lauren was before me.
Oh, Lauren was first. Sorry, Lauren, go ahead. Not good modeling of online teaching there. Okay, go ahead, Lauren.
We've also got Adam and Sarah, so you've got 4 people.
Oh, we do. Damn. Okay, that's good. And we're not all talking over each other, so that's even better. So we'll start with Sarah, and then we'll go through every.
Oh, you're starting with
Sarah,
me?
go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say that I have really loved to learn to use the chat better. Of course, I teach writing, so it's important that they're writing anyway, but I'm getting so much more out of students when I ask them to put their answers in chat than I would if I asked them to speak it. So I just kind of almost decided that I'm not going to ask them to verbalize, but then just write it in the chat. They take longer, but that's okay, because they're writing in more detail. They're giving better examples. They have time to put their thoughts together in ways that they wouldn't otherwise if they just had to spit it out, because I, put them on notice to get it done right away. I have loved the chat feature. In fact, I'm using it to say, okay, now you have a little draft here of your first couple of paragraphs, copy and paste it from your chat and go put it in the first paragraph of your paper. So I'm trying to figure out if I can, if I get back into the classroom and face to face, how to use that chat, because I love it. It's actually better than, calling on people with their hands up, because you're getting students who are reticent to speak in public able to write in public.
I agree, and it's keeping them engaged. If they know that you're going to be calling them to do that, it keeps that engagement level up. I found it very, very difficult at first. I couldn't even see what's going on in the chats, and as you see, even right now, I'm struggling with hands up and everything. So again, not modeling the best behavior here. But what I've done to get around that is actually build in sort of breathing moments in a lecture, that where it can be a question or everyone to put something onto the chat, and then it's controlled where I can go and see what's going on. In the class
I definitely give them time, I was going to say, and I find that I need to give them more time than I think I do. So I try to actually write out the answer to the question that I've just asked them, and then give them a few more minutes even after that, because they can't write as fast as I can. They can't think through the answer. So sometimes I feel like in a classroom setting, when we're asking questions and getting verbal feedback, we're not giving them enough time. But the chat, if I give them enough time, I get beautiful answers.
Yeah, and we have to remember also that one thing I learned is, and I think Charlie was getting at this earlier, I've learned there's a diversity in terms of how people are accessing you in Zoom. I mean, some of them are on their phone or whatever, and if I'm just doing a PowerPoint slides, and just going through it without these breaks for comments or anything, they may have no idea what's going on, because they may not even be seeing what's there. So I've learned, in addition to these controlled use of chats, I've learned that to make sure that the slides are available before class, because of the diversity of experience. But I don't want to do all the talking. I see a ton of hands here, so we'll start. I think Adam's been up there for a while, and then Gohar, and then we've got. Okay, we'll start with that.
I found this really interesting. I've been using Zoom for my classes for at least 6 years. I was just recently looking back to see when I started using Zoom, and it seems to be about 2 years after the company started. So I've had, a lot of different variations in how I use Zoom. And I thought I had a lot of answers for the group until I heard Heath say that he has 100 students in a Zoom, and that almost had me have a heart attack, because I can't imagine that. But from my point of view, there are a few things that really make a Zoom class successful. First and foremost, Judy already brought it up. Is don't expect what you do in the actual classroom to translate perfectly to what happens in a Zoom classroom. There absolutely is a different dynamic, and it takes some time to figure out what that dynamic is and how it works, not only for your students, but for your subject matter, which is important to understand as well. The second thing is, since this is recorded, I'll be very careful how I say this. I strongly encourage my students to use their webcams. And if they are not on webcam, I expect them to notify me in advance that they can't be on the webcam, or if they turn it off, to send me a message just letting me know. I understand the school and the university have gone back and forth in the policies as to whether or not you can require webcams. I teach my students how to use virtual backgrounds. And I tell them that I strongly encourage and expect them to be on webcam, but I can't require it. So if you're not, here's what I want you to do. And I find that it forces a level of engagement that I don't always have if I don't force them to be on webcams. When I do recorded sessions, some sessions are recorded, some sessions are not. But when I do recorded sessions, I specifically tell the students, turn off your webcams if you don't want to be on the recording. I don't mind that at all. And most students will turn off their webcam during recorded parts of my sessions if I need to do that for whatever reason. I also find it useful to use different technologies layered on top of Zoom to keep students engaged. I think the polling feature is absolutely critical.
Amazing.
I love the fact that it's in Zoom. It's easy to use. It's quick to use. It breaks up classes. It allows us to get to take the temperature of the room, sort to say, to see how students are reacting to things. I also think that it's important to keep the class as engaged as possible by engaging with students more than I would in the classroom. So, when I see a student kind of sitting like this during the class and getting really boring, which I see all the time, I'll stop what I'm doing and bring them into the conversation to get them more engaged. And to me, using Zoom is constantly looking at my students, scanning the classroom to see how much interaction I have with my students. I also learned, and this is hard, I also learned that I have to tell them that I expect them to be home or in an office or in an academic-like setting and not do the class from the car or from the supermarket or from other places that I've seen students do Zoom classes from in the past. I mean, this is class. You need to be in a place where it's appropriate to do class. And all those things have just made a big deal, I think, in teaching.
I think those are important points you're raising, Adam. Again, I think it comes back to what I was saying. All of it, it's about the student engagement, and each of these tools, whether we're talking about the use of comments strategically, like Sarah was speaking about, nonverbal cues through the camera being on. Certainly what Judy says is true. We don't want to have to rely on that student disposition, but it's certainly a helpful tool. And in fact, there is some research out there that I've seen. I haven't validated it, how good the research is, but that does speak to certainly higher levels of student engagement and better learning outcomes when the cameras are on. So that's a tricky thing, again, because as Adam said, the policies are against that, largely for privacy reasons. What I've seen or found that students are more likely to want the camera off because they're afraid of being seen, multitasking or being bored or whatever it is. But that's an important indicator for us to sort of engage the class. And the way I try to get them to have their cameras on, because again, I'm very sensitive as well. We can't tell them they have to, is a little bit of the appealing to emotion that maybe Charlie was talking about before, that though it's not required, it helps me in teaching, and it helps other students to see each other in making a good learning environment. And I felt that sometimes is a way that gets people to be more willing to put that camera on. And again, Gora, is your hand up again?
Yeah,
sorry.
I just have a quick comment to make. I just wanted to share the difficulties and the advantages of using Zoom in the classes I did last year. I think one of the greatest things we noticed, so I co-taught a PhD level class last year with a colleague, but before that, before we transitioned into Zoom, we had also taught the same class the year before, so 2019 and 20 and 2021. So the 1920 cohort was less engaged in class, and somehow we both were so incredibly pleasantly surprised to see their engagement levels skyrocket when we transitioned into Zoom, and that was something that was not expected. We had a group of students who were less engaged in actual classroom with us when we were at John Jay, being a lot more involved in the Zoom environment. And we saw same level of engagement from the second cohort. And we didn't really think that Zoom was any kind of hindrance to their learning and engagement. But we also took advantage of the Zoom tools like the breakout rooms, and very frequently. So, the every 15 or 20 minutes, instead of us continuing the lecturing, we broke them out in rooms and gave them the time to think about it, topic and then come back and share it with class. I think that the change of scenery, in a sense, was very helpful, right?
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
In the classroom setting, think, pair, share type situations work to engage students, and I think with the breakout rooms that you've done effectively, it does as well. So.
And the whiteboard. I'm the type of person who, while I'm lecturing, I have to write on the blackboard in class. That's how I lecture. I don't really use much PowerPoint. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So I was happy that I still had that opportunity to write as I speak on the whiteboard. So the Zoom provided that opportunity. The disadvantage of teaching via Zoom was the technological, that we already spoke about them, the students. Luckily, our PhD students didn't turn off, but I also taught an undergrad class where 90% of the students had the opportunity never turned their cameras on. So I did not know at any given time, whether they were there or not. And I did make an effort to call on them, right, to ask a question while I'm lecturing to make sure they're present. But of course, there is the other inherent thing that when you're teaching from home, that your family, your children come and interrupt, and something that you would never have in your own classroom. And I just wanted to share a super funny experience that I had. Here I am all dressed up and made up and trying to look super serious teaching a class, and then my 6-year-old daughter in the middle of my class while I'm teaching screams, "Mommy, I pooped. Can you come wipe my butt?" And all my students can hear it all. It was the whole middle of the classroom teaching experience. So of course, types of interruptions that you wouldn't generally have, not teaching it from, in person in class, were also parts of the experience. But I think overall, it was a positive possible experience that teaching a synchronous class on Zoom. We always have to really just look at the positive sides of things and take advantage of what.
I agree. I think it's become a positive for me. I was honest. It was a horror story at the out the gate, but been able to correct it over time. And again, it's all through these tools, and just having to be very thoughtful of these moments of interaction, and like using the breakout sessions or the chats properly, being more thoughtful than in a face-to-face setting where I can just do it. You know what I mean? So that's been a learning strategy for me as well. We do have a question here from Judy I'll throw out. It says, if a course description for an online course indicates that a camera needs to be used and the student enrolls, is that not consent? Post-pandemic, of course. I think it is. I know the policy is that we can't at all require it. And I, as director of a graduate program, I had one faculty member in particular that actually scored a student 0 on participation because they didn't have the camera on, and so that was an issue. But I don't think just in the course description gives us that consent. I think we're just not allowed to require it, period. But I throw that as a question because I'm not 100% sure on that. Does anyone know? That's how I've been telling my faculty in the graduate program, is it's no bueno.
I've heard that too, Heath. I agree, but I just don't know, moving forward, if the, people are choosing to be online, then, and the course description includes the clause that, hey, you're going to, if there are any synchronous sessions, if it's hybrid, let's say there's synchronous sessions, that the camera has to be on. I don't know if that's consent or not. But then again, there's a definition of fully online means no synchronous sessions, and that those synchronous sessions are totally optional if you have it.
The question, I don't know. I think it's a great question. I do want to sort of circle back to Adam on this, because Adam's points, I think, were realized to why he sort of encourages it, and I really believe it. And I've seen some preliminary literature speaking to the importance of the camp. All of us that teach these synchronous sessions know it's way better when we're looking at someone, and it's a balance. I think this is what you were trying to warn us against, Judy, that we don't want to rely on that as the sole means of gauging student disposition or whatever it may be. But those nonverbal cues, I think, are still very important. So the more we can get people to have the cameras on, I think it's beneficial. And I actually want to turn the question to Charlie, because I know it's too soon for research to have been done on this. I've been looking sort of preliminary stuff, surveys of why students don't turn the camera on, that kind of thing. But from a learning memory outcomes perspective, I would guess that the same principles apply as face-to-face, which is why I say it's all about student engagement, just with different means. And I want to know if you think that's true even through synchronous environments, or if there's anything else that you would think might be coming to play there.
Am I muted? No, okay. Yeah, I mean, so in the research, we usually talk about it in terms of social presence. And I mean, what the research seems to show is when people are more socially present, you tend to have better outcomes. And so it does speak to
the camera.
Right. And I think, because I think one of the difficulties about this transition, I mean, I think 100 years from now, we would laugh at this conversation, but I think one of the difficulties is, you know, when you're in a classroom, you are aware you are in a social environment. But when you're on Zoom, like I'm alone in my office. And so there's a part of my brain that's kind of like, I'm alone, I can do whatever I want. And there's the other part of my brain like, you're on camera and other people can see you, right? There's a disassociation between kind of your proximal environment and then your distal environment. And I think that's part of the difficulty with the transition, and why I think a lot of students like to be with the camera off, right? Because it's hard for them, because they want to act like there's no one around them, but then they know someone could be watching them through the camera. And so I think as we get more online, I think that will start to diminish, and I bet you'll find more people, you know, 5 years from now, 10 years, 20 years from now, being more likely to allow video to be on. But yeah, I mean, I think the benefits of both for the instructor and the student to be having the camera on, right? Because so there's research essentially showing that if you don't really know your listener or you don't get any feedback from your listener, you do a poor job of communicating and so forth. And so even not even just from the student's perspective, but it's I think important for instructors to know they're not just talking to their computer.
To themselves.
Real. Yeah.
I find myself just before I engage better with it, but just staring at the screen and going, did you get that? You know what I mean? Because you just have no way to gauge without nonverbal cues. Is this resonating? And again, this is where we need alternative assessment ways to be able to validate that, again, through chat, questions, think, pair, share, and breakout sessions and the whiteboard. All of that help to get us back there. But right. Sorry, Charlie, I cut you off. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say one last thing, especially from I know we're already over time and maybe others have questions too.
Okay. Another bueno thing to do.
It's easy for me because I'm just staring at my phone, and so the clock is just staring right back at. But I was going to say, you know, and I think Judy was speaking to this, and everyone has spoken to this, Adam as well, and so forth, about really learning the tools. Because as a scientist, one of the things that really interests me is before the pandemic, right? The students that were online, they chose that. Right? They could choose to do an online class or not, right? So at some level, they're going in with an understanding of a certain expectation of what it's going to be like, whereas others chose to be in person. The pandemic equaled everything out. It forced everybody, right? And so now it wasn't a self-selection bias in certain regards. And so it's going to be interesting to see across the board what the learning outcomes are for individuals, say, that never wanted to take an online class. And I think it's going to speak really critically to what tools really work, right? Again, I think what Judy was saying, to what, you know, if we're only interested in the outcome, not necessarily the means, you know, how do we replicate the outcomes for those students that prefer in person, but were then forced to be online? And I think it's going to be a very nuanced answer, and it's going to take a lot of research to figure out what the right answer is for that. But I think it's, from a scientist's perspective, it'd be an interesting study just to see what happens for those students that want the in-person experience and are unavailable to do it.
Agreed. Now that we know we're over time, I do want to, we'll wrap it, but I just want to make sure there's any last outstanding comments someone wants to put out there, or questions. We'll certainly stay with you. Just we'll draw it to a close. I've found it to be a very great conversation, and thank you all for being here. After my panic of Charlie not being here right at the beginning, thank you for patience with that too. So
it was a test, Chief. I was testing you.
I was like, oh no, he's the expert. But anyway, it was
So
fun.
he's a psychologist.
Just messing with your head.
I don't know if you saw me sweating here. I was like, but anyway, it was a great conversation overall. It's always a pleasure, and I come away with new insights, I think, to all of it, from social media to Zoom. Thanks to all of you.
Heath and
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much. This was great, and definitely a community effort. This was a very open conversation. Thank you all. Take good care of yourself, all right?
Thanks everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.